When affirmative action was white. An Untold History of Racial Inequality in 20th Century America. By Ira Katz Nelson. Chapter 1. Doctor of Laws. The sun had begun its downward slope on the evening of June 4, 1965, as President Lyndon Johnson mounted the podium on the main quadrangle of Howard University, the country's most celebrated black center of higher education. The temporary platform erected for the graduation ceremony stood directly in front of Frederick Douglass Memorial Hall, named for the escaped slave who had become the 19th century's most important abolitionist and had served as a trustee at Howard. Dressed in academic robes, draped in a hood of the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws he just had received, the president turned to face an audience of some 5,000 mostly African American students, parents, and family who had been sitting expectantly in the main quadrangle. Reading in the unhurried manner characteristic of his native Texas, Johnson got underway by saluting the university's president, Dr. Nabrit, "My fellow Americans." Then he opened his leather-bound text and began, "I am delighted at the chance to speak at this important and this historic institution, truly a working example of democratic excellence." At the finish, President Johnson was greeted with applause more rapturous than even a president elected by a landslide 7 months earlier might have expected. This, however, was no common occasion. This was no ordinary American leader. And to fulfill these rights was no run-of-the-mill speech. With the country still confronting Southern resistance, this noteworthy address rightly is recalled as the first moment when a president from any region forcefully and visibly sponsored affirmative action for blacks. But the speech also should be remembered for how it highlighted a powerful historical question it did not adequately answer. Why did the disparity between white and black Americans widen after the Second World War despite the country's prosperity? The answers Lyndon Johnson offered were less compelling than his discussion about what to do once legal segregation had ended and voting rights had been secured. The missing words that balmy evening might well have attended to the history of affirmative action for whites. Had the president done so, his inspiriting but rather open-ended conclusions might have placed affirmative action for blacks on a different, arguably more secure foundation. Part 1. June 1965 was no ordinary month. Nearly a year earlier, Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act at the start of July. With segregation and public accommodations now forbidden and discrimination in employment proscribed, the mass civil rights movement turned to voting rights. By the start of 1965, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference had begun to focus attention on Selma, Alabama, where local registrars backed by an oppressive police force outfitted with cattle prods and led by Jim Clark, a jolly caricature of a racist sheriff, had managed to keep black voter registration under 1%. When demonstrations began in Selma on January 18, repercussions were swift in coming. Sheriff Clark arrested hundreds of campaigners, including a great many children. During the start of a Sunday, March 7, protest walk from Selma to Montgomery, Clark's deputies and state troopers beat the 600 marchers after they had crossed the Alabama River, assaulting them with tear gas, whips, and clubs, and trampling them with horses until they retreated to town over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. With 17 hospitalized at Good Samaritan Hospital for fractured legs, arms, ribs, and heads, and another 40 treated for the effects of tear gas and minor wounds in the emergency room, some 200 troopers and pizzamen with riot guns, pistols, tear gas guns and nightsticks later chased all the Negro residents of the Browns Chapel Methodist Church area into their apartments and houses. At the mass meeting of some 700 people who gathered in Brown's Chapel, Hosea Williams, who, in the absence of Dr. King had led the march alongside African-American civil rights leader John Lewis, quietly observed, "I had fought in World War II, and I once was captured by the German army, and I wanted to tell you the Germans never were as inhuman as the state troopers of Alabama." Played out on national television, the piercing cries of terror and the visible brutality of gas-masked troopers riveted the American public. Much of the nation watched news reports of the second, more multiracial march led by Dr. King 2 days later. Protected by federal marshals but barred by an injunction from moving on past the Pettus Bridge, the marchers stopped in front of a double line of Alabama troopers and sang the civil rights movement's leading freedom hymn. If you have never heard 2,000 Negroes and whites sing "We Shall Overcome," hands joined in swaying in 8 abreast rows on US 80 just east of the Alabama River, Andrew Copkind observed, "There is little that can be said to convey the experience. Civil rights demonstrations are now so old that hardly anyone not actually participating feels the essential drama. But for about 10 minutes, the incredibly complex, overplanned, overreported, and certainly unresolved Selma voting rights campaign was invested with a kind of profound passion that the world of pseudo-events rarely sees. No one could say after Tuesday's march whether a column would ever get through to Montgomery, 50 miles away. But the purpose of the whole campaign, to convince the federal government of the need for voting rights legislation, had already been accomplished. 6 days later, President Johnson, who even a decade earlier would have been an unlikely crusader for civil rights, addressed a joint session of Congress to insist on a law to protect the right to vote for all citizens. If Reverend King's I Have a Dream speech at the August 28, 1963, March on Washington had produced the first rhetorical peak for the civil rights movement, this was the second. Speaking to most members of the Senate and House of Representatives in the House chamber, the Virginia and Mississippi delegations were absent. Joined in their boycott by several other Southern representatives, Johnson astonished his audience by the extent of his warm embrace of the movement and its goals as he promised to send Congress a law designed to eliminate illegal barriers to the right to vote. Comparing Selma to Lexington, Concord, and Appomattox, the president identified the black struggle as his, and as the country's own. Their cause must be our cause, too. Because it is not just Negroes, but really it is all of us, who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. Pausing, then raising his arms, Johnson proclaimed the anthem of the movement, "And we shall overcome." Arguably, those 4 words represented the most remarkable transformation by any president in the extended history of race relations since Abraham Lincoln embraced abolition. In the early republic, the United States had, of course, possessed the world's most developed system of racial servitude. This long era culminated in civil war, followed by the military occupation of the South, and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, abolishing slavery, endowing blacks with citizenship, and protecting their right to vote. If only for a moment, the racial question seemed settled. Soon, however, racial oppression took a new form. By 19th century's end, the South had embarked on a thoroughgoing program of legally enforced racial segregation. Dense regulations legislated by state governments sharply restricted the place of African Americans in the public sphere while regulating private, including intimate, relations between blacks and whites. A combination of social conventions, racist ideas, economic compulsion, theological justification, political institutions, and harsh enforcement by police, courts, and prisons, buttressed by private violence, supported the unyielding inequality mandated by Jim Crow. African Americans who lived in the 17 states that made it illegal for whites or blacks to step outside the boundaries defined by this encompassing social order experienced an authoritarian police state, not a democracy of citizens. In this period, Americans living outside the South, in marked contrast to popular abolitionist sentiment before the Civil War, took on an indifference to Southern arrangements combined with their own softer, yet still harsh practices of racial discrimination. This was the age of whiteness. Though not confined to one part of the country, racism was particularly brutal and pervasive south of the Mason-Dixon line. Even for many African Americans, it is now difficult to fathom the omnipresence of racial hierarchy in the region, not just in redneck country but in the South's most progressive cities. Emblematically, as the opening of the movie Gone with the Wind was celebrated in 1939 at a segregated junior league ball in Atlanta, a city described only a few years later by Senator Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi as the hotbed of Southern Negro intelligentsia, communists, pinks, reds, and other off-brands of American citizenship. Entertainment was provided by the Ebenezer Baptist Church Choir, in slave costume, for the all-white guests. Among those who sang Negro spirituals was Martin Luther King Jr., dressed as a pickaninny, then a 10-year-old in the 60-voice group led by his father. Not surprisingly, the post-Second World War civil rights revolution in the courts and streets took aim primarily at the various codes and attributes of Jim Crow rather than at the more muted patterns of racial inequality widely present elsewhere. One by one, barriers to civil rights were overcome. The armed forces were desegregated after an executive order issued by President Harry Truman in 1948. That year, the Democratic Party inserted a civil rights plank into its election platform. A series of landmark Supreme Court decisions culminated, in 1954, in Brown v. Board of Education. Then, After a remarkable and largely peaceful mass movement that often was met with derision and naked force, a Southern Democratic president induced Congress to pass the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and, later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, followed by the Open Housing Act of 1968. Applying a standard of racial neutrality, these new laws brought the corrosive era of Jim Crow to a close. Discrimination by employers and in restaurants, hotels, and other public accommodations was banned. The federal government supported school desegregation and removed the most egregious barriers to fair voting. Bias in the sale or rental of housing became illegal. The Department of Justice and Civil Rights Bureaus in the Departments of Labor, Defense, and Health, Education, and Welfare mobilized to protect racial minorities from racist practices. Just weeks after Selma and his stirring address to Congress on voting rights, President Johnson was at Howard, the focal point of black intellectual life. Now, he took up a theme proclaimed in his speech in March, when he had noted that even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Addressing a still mainly disenfranchised audience in the newly desegregated Washington, D.C., 2 more months were to pass before the Voting Rights Act would be signed into law on August 6. Johnson looked beyond the day when my signature makes this bill, to the law of this land. The freedom it would confer, he insisted, like the liberty to come and go in the public arena or the right not to be denied a job on the basis of color, is not enough. At the heart of the speech lay Johnson's explanation of why civil rights initiatives were insufficient and why something more, transcending equal treatment, was needed. In the part of the speech we rightly remember as the harbinger of official affirmative action, Johnson explained, "You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying, 'Now you are free to go where you want, and do as you desire, and choose the leaders as you please.' You do not take a person who, for years, has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race and then say, 'You are free to compete with all the others,' and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus is it not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates." Declaring this to be the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights, the president shifted ground. "We seek not just freedom but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory but equality as a fact and equality as a result." What many in this audience specifically knew was just how far this president had moved in a mere decade and a half. The title of Johnson's Howard speech deliberately echoed the 1947 report of the Committee on Civil Rights that President Harry Truman had created by executive order in December 1946. To secure these rights chronicled the gap between democratic promises and racist practices. At a moment when ending the familiar system of racial segregation in both public and private institutions which cuts across the daily lives of Southern citizens from cradle to grave seemed a utopian project, the committee projected segregation's demise. Only the termination of segregation in schools, housing, public accommodations, and the armed forces, and only an end to lynching. There were 6 episodes in 1946, police brutality, the denial of suffrage, and discrimination at work, in healthcare, and public services, the writers argued, could make American democracy whole. Even the most equal version of Jim Crow, it urged, could not alter this basic fact. A law which forbids a group of American citizens to associate with other citizens in the ordinary course of daily living creates inequality by imposing a caste status on the minority group. Johnson's own personal transformation reflected a sea change many could never have imagined. In 1948, a year after the Committee on Civil Rights advocated a wide-ranging, multifaceted civil rights program geared to achieve the elimination of segregation, based on race, color, creed, or national origin, from American life, Congressman Lyndon Johnson of Texas, a staunch New Dealer, was elected to the U.S. Senate. His maiden speech, light years away in content from either his voting rights speech or the Howard University address, was delivered on March 9, 1949. President Truman, after his unexpected re-election and the committee's report, had proposed a civil rights program aimed at easing restrictions on black voting, using federal power to curb lynching, and working against discrimination in the labor market by making permanent the Wartime Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC. Southern senators mounted a filibuster. Their most eloquent spokesman was the new senator from Texas. Johnson repeatedly punctuated his long speech in the Senate, lasting 1.5 hours, with the phrase "we of the South." Despite his own abhorrence of racial prejudice and instruments of exclusion like the poll tax, views he underlined, he mounted a series of arguments that supported not just this specific pro-Jim Crow filibuster but unlimited debate in the Senate as an instrument of freedom irrespective of its effects. In advancing a vision of Southern prerogatives based on a particular view of the Constitution and of federalism rather than on a direct endorsement of racism, Johnson nonetheless disdained anti-discrimination efforts as a form of slave-like compulsion. He also opposed federal intervention in voting rights, he told the Senate, not because he was against the Negro race but because this is not the way to accomplish what so many want to do for the Negro. Imposition from outside the South, he cautioned, might keep alive the old flames of hate and bigotry. Composed in manner and sensible in tone, Johnson reached into an Orwellian kitbag to explain why a federal commission on fair employment would be tantamount to servitude. If the law can compel me to employ a Negro, it can compel that Negro to work for me. It might even tell him how long and how hard he would have to work. As I see it, such a law would do nothing more than enslave a minority. Further, he insisted that the Negro, as a minority group involved in this discussion of civil rights, has more to lose by the adoption of any resolution outlawing free debate in the Senate than he stands to gain by the enactment of the civil rights bills as they are now written. Senator Johnson thus effectively guarded a social order propped up by racist legislation. For that, he was accepted by his Southern colleagues as one of their own. When he had represented a relatively liberal district, with few black residents, in the hill country adjoining Austin and the prairie country extending east toward Houston, Johnson never spoke about racial questions on the House floor, even as he voted against every civil rights bill considered during his tenure. But the Senate was different. Now, he represented Texas, as he explained to his page, Bobby Baker, later a key aide. "I am a Texan and I've got a Southern constituency." At the speech's end, the Lubbock Journal reported, a long line of Southern senators formed to shake his hand, and his mailbox soon filled with hundreds of supportive letters from constituents. 15 years later, the contrast could not have been more stark. No longer constrained by a Texas constituency, his own views and commitments had developed with unexpected vigor. By the time Johnson faced his audience at Howard University's commencement as President of the United States, he had become a revolutionary. Having moved through and beyond the upheaval in civil rights to emerge as a leader of racial change, most of his Southern colleagues considered him a turncoat and defector. Now, speaking at the black heart of the nation's capital, he took yet another startling step by promoting inequality of outcomes as the measure of how well the country would cross its still stark divide. To fulfill these rights posed two main questions. In the same year that the psychologist Kenneth Clark's landmark study of Harlem spoke of the country's dark ghettos as social, political, educational, and, above all, economic colonies whose inhabitants are subject peoples, President Johnson asked why the gap between blacks and whites actually had grown in the 2 decades after the end of the Second World War. His description of the much grimmer story of black economic and social progress during the post-war years began by observing that the great majority of Negro Americans, still, as we meet here tonight, are another nation. Despite the court orders and the laws, despite the legislative victories and the speeches, for them the walls are rising and the gulf is widening. What should be done after the end of legal segregation and the imminent passage of voting rights legislation? Johnson inquired. And how could all Americans be accorded the same starting point in the pursuit of opportunity? To this end, Johnson insisted, equal opportunity is essential, but not enough, not enough. In a post-civil rights period, with the legal playing field leveled, with color expunged as an officially sanctioned badge of deprivation, when, if at all, should race count in authoritative public decisions? One of the more remarkable features of this eloquent address is the role it assigned to history. Johnson's playing field metaphor evocatively underscored a compensatory approach to racial justice. As Hugh Davis Graham, a historian of affirmative action, astutely has observed, the president was announcing a theory justifying compensation for past racism that found its grounding not in the Constitution or statutes or in liberal traditions of equal treatment. Rather, the social force that justified the new doctrine of race-conscious affirmative action was history itself, in the form of past discrimination. But which history? The primary shortcoming of Johnson's speech was its surprising neglect of the history of public policy that had acted as a key cause of the distressing outcomes he chronicled. As a result, not only did its historical account remain vague, substituting expressive language for hard-edged analysis, but the repertoire of possible answers Johnson announced was unordered and unspecific, leaving unresolved just how he preferred to remedy the cumulative history of racial disadvantage. The dilemma he raised about what to do next remained an open question. But if the president provided only a first draft of adequate answers, he did pose just the right questions by directing the attention of his audience to past causes and future possibilities. This book offers a second draft, in the form of an extended commentary, on the main themes and to fulfill these rights. How shall we understand the mischance to fashion black mobility and create a robust African American middle class in the 2 decades after the Second World War? And what should we do to address the unequal powers of race even after the legislative work of the Civil Rights Revolution has been accomplished? These two questions can be connected by supplying the history President Johnson did not tell. 3 aspects define my reflections on why black difficulty and disadvantage took root in the generation before the end of Jim Crow and on how, in light of this history, the goal of broadly equal results across racial lines best can be advanced. The first and most fundamental is a historical account of the moment when affirmative action was white. The second is a line of argument about race and affirmative action. The third is an approach to policy today. Ordinarily, chronicles of affirmative action began in the early 1960s. They focus on the critical moment between 1963 and 1969 when such policies moved from obscurity to become the single most important federal policy for dealing with employment discrimination, and extend forward to encompass the 4 decades when affirmative action was black. Writing about the limited qualities of most such accounts, the historian Thomas Segru has cautioned that they ordinarily substitute a flattened image of the past, one of a colorblind constitution and a golden age of racial cooperation, an image that is historically false, and thus repress the far more complicated and troubled history of racial liberalism. Such approaches obscure important features of public policy in the earlier decades when affirmative action was white. Without this record, the history of affirmative action is incomplete. Part 2. The issue posed first by Lyndon Johnson was the economic condition of Black America, considered both on its own terms and in relationship to the striking advances most whites had experienced in the last 2 decades. Shortly after the Howard Address, the journalist Haynes Johnson visited Alabama to chronicle the aftermath of the marches in Selma. He discovered dire conditions, the kind that had inspired the president to believe that civil rights, however robust, would prove insufficient, even derisory, for those stuck at the bottom. Economically, the outlook for the Negro is still bleak. There are few jobs. There are still no street lights in the Negro sections. The housing and plumbing is abysmal. The streets are still unpaved. The wages are still below any reasonable minimum. In Selma, a Negro who earns $50 a week is a wealthy man. Next month when the cotton crop is picked, the Negroes who work in the fields will receive $2 a day. A maid in Selma can expect $10 a week. If she works 6 days in a laundry, she will get $12. At one motel, part of a national chain, a maid earns the top figure of $22.50 a week for an 8-hour day. And outside Selma, in the farmland through which the marchers made their way, the conditions are worse. Soon the country discovered that black despair was not confined to the South. Weeks later, the Watts district of Los Angeles was in flames. The president, of course, had not predicted the ghetto riots that soon would convulse the country, nor did he forecast the nationalist turn the black movement was soon to take. But his unprecedented talk about the dark intensity of prejudice, the limits of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the lacerating hurt and uncomprehending pain of the special nature of Negro poverty did provide a realistic account of the country's racial situation, particularly its stark economic disparities. At the heart of his moving address was a methodical, reasoned, diagnostic core that not only described the grim economic circumstances in Black America but offered an analysis of their underlying causes. Johnson focused closely on the depths of racism and the decay of the traditional black family because he wished to do more than describe African American distress. His quest for sources and foundations was impelled by the desire that black disadvantage must be overcome, if we are ever to reach the time when the only difference between Negroes and whites is the color of their skin. As Johnson knew, the Second World War had followed an especially dismal period for African Americans, one even more grim than for the population as a whole. During the Great Depression, blacks had experienced sharp downward mobility, losing the economic gains hundreds of thousands had secured by moving northward during the First World War. The principle of last hired, first fired placed many migrants who recently had joined the North's labor force at a special disadvantage. The world economy's collapse after 1929, especially as it affected agriculture, deepened the poverty experienced by the vast majority of the South's black workforce. The ruinous economy in the 1930s also closed off the option that earlier had opened up as a result of the robust demand for labor in the North during periods of wartime mobilization and post-war prosperity. Further, the small, fragile black middle classes on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line came under intense pressure, having gained only a very tenuous attachment to stable jobs with regular wage incomes, cultural respectability, and chances for mobility before the Depression hit. In all, the period spanning 1929 to December 1941, when American participation in the Second World War began, was one of the bleakest economic periods for black employment since the close of Reconstruction. Much changed as a result of the Second World War. Unemployment virtually disappeared for both white and black Americans. Black migration to the North resumed, spurred by well-paid and stable jobs in the war production industries, putting pressure on Southern as well as Northern labor markets. Unionization advanced. By 1945, more than 20% of the private workforce in the South belonged to unions, many multiracial, a proportion nearly twice that for the United States as a whole today. Though the military remained racially segregated and offered whites far more access to skilled positions than blacks, the armed forces did offer some African American soldiers occupational and literacy training and presented all who served with the Republican standing of soldier-citizen. Further, the cultural and political terms of the Second World War as a war against fascism made the most outrageous expressions of racism increasingly suspect. The vibrant period of growth that followed the war offered further economic opportunities. Even with the sharp upward trend toward better living standards, more urbanization, and greater economic growth, the racial gap widened. Just at the moment the United States developed an increasingly suburban middle-class bulge, and Irish and Italian Catholics and Jews were advancing into mainstream white culture, African Americans remained stuck, in the main, in economically marginal class locations. When President Johnson in 1964 announced a Great Society effort to eradicate poverty and complete the New Deal, it was widely understood to be an effort directed at black poverty and the exclusion of African Americans from the middle-class mainstream. The gulf between white and black Americans was the primary problem the president highlighted at Howard. Citing information provided by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of the authors of the Howard speech, Johnson chronicled the facts of this American failure. 35 years ago the rate of unemployment for Negroes and whites was about the same. Tonight, the Negro rate is twice as high. In 1948 the 8% unemployment rate for Negro teenage boys was actually less than that of whites. By last year, that rate had grown to 23%, as against 13% for whites unemployed. Between 1949 and 1959, the income of Negro men relative to white men declined in every section of this country. From 1952 to 1963 the median income of Negro families compared to white actually dropped from 57% to 53%. In the years 1955 through 1957, 22% of experienced Negro workers were out of work at some time during the year. In 1961 through 1963 that proportion had soared to 29%. Since 1947 the number of white families living in poverty has decreased 27% while the number of poorer non-white families decreased only 3%. The infant mortality of non-whites in 1940 was 70% greater than whites. 22 years later it was 90% greater. Moreover, the isolation of Negro from white communities is increasing, rather than decreasing as Negroes crowd into the central cities and become a city within a city. Of course Negro Americans as well as white Americans have shared in our rising national abundance. But the harsh fact of the matter is that in the battle for true equality too many, far too many, are losing ground every day. The issue, as Johnson saw it, was not that blacks in the mid-1960s were as collectively poor as they had been in the prior generation. Rather, Johnson asked how white and black income and wealth could have grown more, not less, distinct in the post-war golden age. Despite the grimness of these developments, he also recognized what he could see, in microcosm, seated before him, the rise of a black middle class. indicating that this graduating class at Howard University is witness to the indomitable determination of the Negro American to win his way in American life. Johnson remarked that the black population in higher education had doubled since 1950, and he saluted the enormous accomplishments of distinguished individual Negroes, many of them graduates of this institution. But these proud and impressive achievements tell only the story of a growing middle-class minority, steadily narrowing the gap between them and their white counterparts. What, he inquired, had accounted for these growing disparities despite nearly 2 decades of unbroken and unprecedented abundance? Why had an unparalleled possibility been missed to include the most downtrodden in the full embrace of post-war prosperity and advance their membership in the country's growing middle class? With the identification of this growing gap between black and white Americans, the president advanced an uncommonly analytical explanation for a political address. "We are not completely sure," he confessed, "why this is. But among the complex and subtle causes, he singled out 2 for special mention. First, Negroes are trapped, as many whites are trapped, in inherited, gateless poverty. Such poverty is deeper and more distinctive. Negro poverty is not white poverty. The differences," he hastened to explain, "are not racial differences. They are solely and simply the consequence of ancient brutality, past injustice, and present prejudice. Unlike blacks, the white poor, many of whom had escaped its shackles, did not have the heritage of centuries to overcome, and they did not have a cultural tradition which had been twisted and battered by endless years of hatred and hopelessness, nor were they excluded, these others, because of race or color, a feeling whose dark intensity is matched by no other prejudice in our society." The second cause, embedded in the first, he identified as the breakdown of the Negro family structure, which he attributed to centuries of oppression and persecution of the Negro man. Here, of course, the president echoed the findings and arguments published just 2 months earlier in Moynihan's controversial Department of Labor report, "The Negro Family, The Case for National Action." A self-perpetuating tangle of pathology, marked by the deterioration of the Negro family and produced by 3 centuries of injustice, it had argued, blocked black mobility. For this reason, Moynihan advocated that a national effort towards the problems of Negro Americans must be directed towards the question of family structure. Neither of these arguments can be dismissed. The barriers to black advancement indeed were more pervasive and deep as a result of the country's long history of racial oppression. No doubt, too, families with 1 adult tended to be more poor than those with 2. Still, these explanations were insufficient. Other possibilities were ignored. A radical decline in agricultural employment in the South and the start of deindustrialization in the North combined to limit opportunities at the bottom of the economic structure. Lags in skill training, more limited access to higher education, and persistent private discrimination by employers, banks, landlords, and other suppliers of economic opportunity also blocked black mobility. Even the most successful fraction of black America, professionals, small business people, white-collar workers in public life, and industrialized workers in union jobs, faced new stresses. The end of Jim Crow, migration northward, and the start of desegregation in education wore away their insulated niches, and left them with fewer assets and greater insecurities than their white counterparts. Yet even more important, and entirely absent from the president's account, was the set of causes that will be highlighted in more detail in the chapters below, how the wide array of significant and far-reaching public policies that were shaped and administered during the New Deal and Fair Deal era of the 1930s and 1940s were crafted and administered in a deeply discriminatory manner. This was no accident. Still an era of legal segregation in 17 American states and Washington, D.C., the southern wing of the Democratic Party was in a position to dictate the contours of Social Security, key labor legislation, the GI Bill, and other landmark laws that helped create a modern white middle class in a manner that also protected what these legislators routinely called the Southern way of life. Part 3. Ironically, though no one was in a better position to understand this legislative history than Lyndon Johnson, he left it unspoken at Howard, putting aside what, arguably, was the leading reason the gap between whites and blacks had widened since the Second World War. It was a curious omission, because he was intimately familiar with this history of lawmaking. Before his election as vice president in 1960 and his ascension to the presidency in 1963, Lyndon Johnson had been a remarkably effective legislator, first in the House of Representatives, then, as Majority Leader, as Master of the Senate. During the course of his presidency, moreover, he continued to bring this unparalleled ability into play to craft and guide groundbreaking legislation through Congress. And yet, his analysis at Howard avoided discussing the racial consequences of the control exercised over congressional legislation by representatives from the South, a group that included naked and strident racists like Theodore Bilbo and Cotton Ed Smith, urbane and publicly moderate guardians of segregation like Richard Russell, and expert non-racist liberals like Claude Pepper and Lyndon Johnson. As Congress acted to regulate labor markets and enhance the powers of employees, provide welfare and social insurance, build a powerful military, and reintegrate soldiers into post-war America, its Southern members introduced features to fortify their region's social, economic, and political order. The exclusion of so many Black Americans from the bounty of public policy, and the way in which these important, large-scale national programs were managed, launched new and potent sources of racial inequality. The federal government, though seemingly race-neutral, functioned as a commanding instrument of white privilege. The Jim Crow contingent in the House of Representatives and the Senate, the We of the South Johnson had embraced symbolically and substantively in his maiden Senate speech, made it so. Because no bills could be legislated into law without the assent of the members of Congress from that region, a result of the balance of partisanship between Republicans and Democrats, the composition of the Democratic Party, and rules that required filibuster-proof votes in the Senate, public policy had to be tailored to meet their preferences, most notably their desire to protect Jim Crow. All this the president did not say. His personal record and sense of pride were at odds with the quality of his history. Yet without an appraisal of how the Southern wing of the Democratic Party had imposed its preferences on the country, it was impossible for him persuasively to explain the racial contours of post-war American capitalism and the impact of color on the country's class structure. As a result, the account he offered at Howard with such an engaging combination of feeling and factual information missed the chance to come to terms with the most dismal, even exploitative, aspects of the New Deal and the Fair Deal. Such a retrospective assessment, of course, measuring what he and his regional colleagues had accomplished, would have been particularly agonizing for a man so identified with that era's most significant lawmaking. The Democratic Party that fashioned and superintended the New Deal and Fair Deal combined two different political systems, one that was incorporating new groups and voters, who had arrived from overseas or had migrated from the South, the other still an authoritarian one-party system, still beholden to racial separation. Racism, to be sure, was not confined to the South. Irrespective of where they lived, most white Americans before the Civil Rights era were indifferent to Jim Crow. Yet only in, and surrounding, the former Confederacy did the formal political system utilize race to exclude adults from citizenship and full access to civil society. Private terror combined with public law and enforcement to make this political system authentically totalitarian. Competitive party politics did not exist. Electoral contests were enacted inside the one dominant party. Within the South, inter-party conflicts were virtually unknown. Struggles between individuals and factions were resolved within the ambit of Democratic Party primaries. As a consequence, representation in Washington was the near-exclusive province of only one of the two great national parties. Further, this electoral arrangement was an integral part of a coherent racial civilization, with a distinctive heritage, economy, social geography, and culture. Within this framework there was in fact a great deal of heterogeneity, as in the differences in political behavior and style of upland whites and black belt whites. When engaged in the politics of representation outside the region, virtually all the South's members of Congress, however, stood together to preserve the basic contours of the region's racial regime. This was the premise of Southern representation, and accounted for its survival. Two-party competition, V. O. Key Jr., had observed in his classic study, Southern Politics and State and Nation, 1949, would have meant the destruction of Southern solidarity in national politics. Unity on the national scene was essential in order that the largest possible bloc could be mobilized to resist any national move toward interference with Southern authority to deal with the race question as was desired locally. Southern seniority was exaggerated by not having to compete in a two-party system. Members from the region thus secured a disproportionate number of committee chairmanships, giving them special gatekeeping powers. Further, the filibuster in the Senate served to advance Southern power. These features of Southern representation combined to make the preferences and sufferance of the South central to all key features of the New Deal. In effect, The South maintained a legislative veto throughout this formative period. Put more abstractly, the core institutions of America's liberal regime, its pattern of congressional representation and its party system, placed the South's practices at the center of Washington's politics and policymaking. Once in Washington as elected representatives in the House and Senate, the Southern members on Democratic credentials were sanitized. They were treated as delegates of the people just like any other. Allied as solid South Democrats, they affiliated with other Democrats to compose House and Senate majorities during most of the New Deal period. Before 1932, the majority of the Democratic Party in Congress had been Southern. Even after the massive non-Southern realignment in 1932 and 1936 that rendered Southern representatives a numerical minority within the Democratic Party, the core of its senior members and its leading edge of continuity and legislative influence remained Southern. As the great agent of social policy change in the New Deal and post-war periods, this Democratic Party partnership of strange bedfellows produced a series of strange deals that, together, constituted a program of affirmative action granting white Americans privileged access to state-sponsored economic mobility. The South used its legislative powers to transfer its priorities about race to Washington. Its leaders imposed them, with little resistance, on New Deal policies. Even at the height of the New Deal, the Democratic Party required Southern acquiescence to the national program. Rising to oppose a 1940 anti-lynching bill, Congressman John Rankin of Mississippi cautioned Northern Democrats to remember that Southern Democrats now have the balance of power in both houses of Congress. By your conduct you may make it impossible for us to support many of you for important committee assignments, and other positions to which you aspire. You Democrats who are pushing this vicious measure are destroying your usefulness here. The Republicans would be delighted to see you cut President Roosevelt's throat politically, and are therefore voting with you on this vicious measure. They know that if he signs it, it will ruin him in the Southern states, and that if he vetoes it, they can get the benefit of the Negro votes this vicious measure would inflict in the North. Their advantageous situation made it possible for Southern members of Congress to support Democratic Party legislation provided the integrity of the South's matrix would remain unquestioned as a matter of local option. During the Depression and the Second World War, Southerners in Congress were forced to embark on a great balancing act. They were reassured by the apparent resemblance between the New Deal and Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom, when Jim Crow had been strengthened, and were enthusiastic about the much-needed bounty federal public spending could provide. Concurrently, they distrusted an enhanced central state because they worried that its agencies would be placed in the hands of administrators from other regions who would possess a great deal of discretion. Further, with the glimmerings of the civil rights protest, early pro-civil rights decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court, and support for civil rights by some leading Democrats, Southern anxiety continued to grow throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Our position is desperate, Georgia's Richard Russell wrote to his fellow Senator, Sam Ervin of North Carolina, for we are hopelessly outnumbered. But we are not going to yield an inch. They did not. The South's representatives built ramparts within the policy initiatives of the New Deal and the Fair Deal to safeguard their region's social organization. They accomplished this aim by making the most of their disproportionate numbers on committees, by their close acquaintance with legislative rules and procedures, and by exploiting the gap between the intensity of their feeling and the relative indifference of their fellow members of Congress. They used three mechanisms. First, whenever the nature of the legislation permitted, they sought to leave out as many African Americans as they could. They achieved this not by inscribing race into law but by writing provisions that, in Robert Lieberman's language, were racially laden. The most important instances concerned categories of work in which blacks were heavily overrepresented, notably farm workers and maids. These groups, constituting more than 60% of the black labor force in the 1930s and nearly 75% of those who were employed in the South, were excluded from the legislation that created modern unions, from laws that set minimum wages and regulated the hours of work, and from Social Security until the 1950s. Second, they successfully insisted that the administration of these and other laws, including assistance to the poor and support for veterans, be placed in the hands of local officials who were deeply hostile to black aspirations. Over and over, the bureaucrats who were handed authority by Congress used their capacity to shield the Southern system from challenge and disruption. Third, They prevented Congress from attaching any sort of anti-discrimination provisions to a wide array of social welfare programs such as community health services, school lunches, and hospital construction grants, indeed all the programs that distributed monies to their region. As a consequence, at the very moment when a wide array of public policies was providing most white Americans with valuable tools to advance their social welfare, ensure their old age, get good jobs, acquire economic security, build assets, and gain middle-class status, most black Americans were left behind or left out. Affirmative action then was white. New national policies enacted in the pre-civil rights, last gasp era of Jim Crow constituted a massive transfer of quite specific privileges to white Americans. New programs produced economic and social opportunity for favored constituencies and thus widened the gap between white and black Americans in the aftermath of the Second World War. And the effects, as we will see, did not stop even after discriminatory codes were swept aside by the civil rights movement and the legislation it inspired. Part 4. For what is justice? Lyndon Johnson asked as he concluded to fulfill these rights. It is to fill the fair expectations of man. In America, he observed, justice connotes a nation where each man could be ruled by the common consent of all and where all of every station and origin would be touched equally in obligation and in liberty. Beyond the law, he continued, lay the land. It was a rich land, glowing with more abundant promise than man had ever seen. Here, unlike any place yet known, all were to share the harvest. And beyond this was the dignity of man. He paused, then the timbre of his voice, the recordings indicate, increased in resonance as he continued, this is American justice. We have pursued it faithfully to the edge of our imperfections, and we have failed to find it for the American Negro. A few sentences later he was done, closing an address that had offered history, analysis, and policy in a strong revivalist cadence by calling, in biblical tones, for Americans to light a candle of understanding in the heart of all America. And, once lit, it will never go out again. When the reverberating applause calmed, the president remained standing together with the audience filling the main quadrangle as the evening closed with the Howard University choir singing We Shall Overcome. The special atmosphere of that occasion may be long past, but its qualities demand revival. President Johnson's question still haunts. For what, indeed, is justice, when measured against the moment affirmative action was white?